She had not been touched with tenderness in 30 years. She had stopped noticing the absence. That was the thing she would later understand, that the moment you stop noticing, what you are missing is not peace. It is just a very convincing kind of loss. The infirmary was dark except for one lantern. Glass vials in rows. Dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. A chair by the window worn smooth from decades of the same woman sitting in the same place at the same hour because sleep had stopped coming easily sometime in her 50s, and she had decided that was fine. She had decided a lot of things were fine. Her name was Isadora Moonveil. She was the pack healer. She had delivered their babies and buried their secrets and sat beside their dying when no one else could bear to stay in the room. 36 years of being the most useful woman in the pack. Not the most celebrated. Not the most loved. The most useful. Then the door opened without a knock. And the most powerful man in the Moonveil pack was standing in her doorway at 2 in the morning holding his side like he was trying to keep something in and looking at her the way men look when they have run out of every other option. She was 59 years old. She had buried a mate, raised a pack, and decided with the clean certainty of a woman who has been disappointed enough times to stop counting that love was a thing that happened to other people. She had made her peace with the life she had. She was about to find out how fragile that peace actually was. This video took real time and real care to build for you. If you are already subscribed, that means more than I can say. If you are not yet, I would ask you to consider it before we go further. This story deserves to be told all the way through. The button is right there. Now, let's begin. Start with her hands. That is always where you start with Isadora Moonveil. Everything else about her, her age, her rank, her 36 years of quiet service to a pack that had stopped seeing her long ago, all of it was secondary to what her hands told you. They were scarred from decades of work. Small burns from the heating of compounds. A ridge of callus along the right index finger from years of writing in ledgers by candlelight. The kind of hands that had been inside wounds, had mixed medicines in the dark, had pressed against injuries, and held still when everything around them was chaos. They were not the hands of a woman who had been gentle her whole life. They were the hands of a woman who had chosen gentleness as the most effective instrument available and used it with the precision of someone who understood that the right tool applied correctly was more powerful than any amount of force. She was up an hour before the lodge stirred. Always. Not because the rules required it. Not because anyone had asked. Because the hour before the rest of the pack opened its eyes was the only hour in the day that moved at her pace rather than everyone else's. She used it the same way every morning. Check the stores. Note what needed restocking. Review the previous day's patient records against her own memory of each case. Look for the detail that didn't sit right. The symptom that didn't match. The number that was slightly off. She had been doing this for 36 years. The method was identical on the first day and the last. She did not perform dedication. She did not require anyone to witness her commitment in order to maintain it. She simply showed up. Every morning. In the dark. Because the work had long since stopped being something she did and become something she was. The pack relied on her completely. They thanked her almost never. This was not a dramatic failing on their part. It was something quieter and more ordinary than that. It was the particular invisibility of the person who is always there. A senior pack member named Aldous came to collect the monthly preventative medicines she prepared for the border patrol wolves. He took the carefully labeled bag from her table without looking up from the conversation he was already having with the man behind him. She watched him leave. She made a note to restock the primary compound by Thursday. A young wolf named Dax recovered from a deep shoulder wound that had come within a finger width of killing him. She had worked on that wound for 4 hours the night he came in. 3 weeks later, fully healed, he saw Atticus in the main hall and thanked him for the pack's care. Atticus, to his credit, told the boy to thank his healer. Dax came to the infirmary the following afternoon with a slightly embarrassed expression and a handshake that was warm enough to be genuine. She appreciated the handshake. She did not require it. Pack members knocked on her door at midnight and apologized for the hour. They had been doing this for years. The apology was real every time. The behavior never changed. She had stopped expecting it to change sometime in her 40s. She opened the door and she helped whoever was standing on the other side, and she went back to whatever she had been doing. She did not resent any of it. That is the thing that is hardest to explain about Isadora Moonveil, and the thing that matters most. She was not performing patience. She was not swallowing bitterness and calling it grace. She genuinely did not expect more. She had made herself indispensable. She had never made herself important. In the Moonveil pack, those two things were not the same. She understood that. She had made her peace with it. The peace had cost her something. It always does. His name was Emery. He was not a great warrior. He held no significant political position in the pack. He was a cartographer by trade, a man who spent his days making maps of territories that changed slower than the maps themselves. He was 31 when he married Isadora. He was 34 when he died. What he was, more than anything else, was someone who saw her. Not the healer. Not the function. Her. He asked her opinions on things that had nothing to do with medicine, and then waited for the full answer before responding. He left wildflowers from the eastern meadow on her work table, the small pale ones that bloomed in early spring, because he had noticed once that she paused when she walked past them, and he understood that she would never buy them for herself. He did not make a ceremony of leaving them. He simply left them, without note or explanation, and went back to his maps. He died on a Tuesday in late autumn. A border raid that should not have happened. A senior wolf's bad decision that sent younger wolves into territory they had no intelligence on and no preparation for. Isadora was in the infirmary treating a sprained wrist when the rider came. She finished the treatment. She thanked the patient. She waited until the room was empty. Then she sat down on the floor with her back against the supply cabinet, and she did not move for a long time. She got up. She washed her hands. She went back to work. She has been going back to work ever since. Not because the grief resolved. Not because the loss became manageable in the way people promise it will. But because going back to work was the one thing she knew how to do, and she had patients, and they needed her, and needing to be needed is a particular kind of medicine that healers are often the last to recognize they are taking. She did not stop loving because she stopped being capable of it. She stopped because the cost was a debt she decided at 31 she could not afford to pay twice. She folded that part of herself away with the same methodical care she applied to everything else. Neatly. Completely. And she told herself she was at peace with it. She was mostly right. Callum Starweaver knocked on the infirmary door at 8:30 on a Thursday morning and let himself in before she answered, which was the particular privilege of someone who had spent 7 years learning medicine in this room and had not yet fully accepted that his apprenticeship was over. He was 33. He had his own patients, his own caseload, his own small practice in the lodge's western wing. He still checked in with Isadora every few days with the persistence of someone who tells himself it is professional and knows it is something else entirely. He set a cup of tea on her table. She did not look up from the ledger. He sat in the chair across from her and talked about his morning rounds in the comfortable, rambling way of someone who has learned that Isadora listens better when she appears not to be listening. He mentioned, near the end, that there had been a supply delivery that morning to the wrong location. Medical stores that should have come to the infirmary had been signed for at the Eastern Supply Depot instead. Probably a routing error. He had already sent a note to have it corrected. He moved on to the next thing. She wrote something in the margin of the ledger. She kept her face exactly as it always was. She filed it. That night at 2 a.m, the door to the infirmary opened without a knock. She had been awake. She was always awake at 2 a.m. She looked up from her book and Atticus Shadowfrost was in the doorway, and she understood in the first 3 seconds of looking at him 3 things simultaneously. He was injured. He had come here deliberately rather than to the lodge physician. And he had not told anyone he was coming. He was holding his left side. Not dramatically. with the controlled, economic pressure of a man who had been managing the pain long enough to have developed a system for it. His face was set in the particular way that powerful men set their faces when they require help and have not yet finished resenting the requirement. He looked at her the way people look at the last available option when all the preferred options have been exhausted. She set her book down. "I was told you don't ask questions." "I was told wrong." She stood. She crossed to the supply cabinet. She did not ask him to sit. She asked him 3 questions. "How long ago? How deep? Has this happened before?" He answered all 3 without hesitation, which told her 2 things. He had expected the questions, and he respected precision. She worked in silence. Her hands were completely steady. She was aware at some point during the treatment that his face had changed slightly. Not in response to the pain, which was considerable. In response to her. To the fact that she had not adjusted her manner for him in any way. Had not softened or stiffened or performed competence for his benefit. She simply worked. She did not require his authority. She did not require his approval. She had never required either of those things from anyone, and she was not about to begin. She finished. She told him the aftercare requirements in the same tone she used for everyone else. He stood. He moved toward the door. He stopped. His hand was on the frame. He stood there for a moment that was longer than leaving required and shorter than speaking required. Whatever he had been going to say, he decided against it. He left. She stood in the silence of the infirmary and noticed, with a mild and specific irritation that she did not examine too closely, that the room felt different now that he was gone. Not empty. Different. The way a room feels after a window has been briefly opened and then closed again. She went back to her book. She did not find her place immediately. She went back to work. Isadora treated the most powerful man in the pack exactly the same way she treated everyone else. No performance. No deference. Just the work. When was the last time you met someone who genuinely didn't need anything from you? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Genevieve Shadowfrost was not what people thought she was. People thought she was gracious. They were right about that. She moved through pack gatherings with the particular ease of a woman who understood that warmth deployed with precision is a form of power, and she had been deploying it for 20 years with results that no one fully credited her for because the results looked effortless. The pack saw a beautiful, composed Luna who made everyone feel welcome at the table. They did not see the woman who had built that table, arranged the seating, and quietly determined who sat where and why. Isadora saw her more clearly than most. Not because they were close. They were not close. There was too much professional distance for that, too many years of Isadora holding the Luna's medical history in confidence, too many conversations that existed only in the infirmary and were never repeated outside it. What they had was something more durable than friendship. It was the particular mutual respect of 2 capable women in an environment that undervalued both of them, who had each looked at the other and recognized something true. Genevieve came in for her routine quarterly check on a Wednesday afternoon in late autumn. She sat across from Isadora in the chair that Atticus would sit in 3 years later. She answered the standard questions with the standard directness. She was well. Her sleep had been adequate. The joint pain in her right hand that had troubled her the previous winter had not returned. Then she mentioned, in the tone of someone noting a minor administrative matter, that she had been reviewing the Eastern supply records. That she had found something unusual. A pattern in the routing of certain goods that did not match the official procurement logs. She had not yet confirmed it. She was going to bring it to Atticus in a few days when she had the full picture. She wanted Isadora to know in case anything came of it. In case she needed a witness to the conversation. Isadora noted the date and the content in her private ledger that evening. The way she noted everything. Genevieve was dead within the week. The illness came on fast. That was the first thing that didn't sit right. Isadora had been treating Genevieve for 2 decades. She knew the woman's body the way a cartographer knows a territory, every landmark, every variation, Every small anomaly that was simply part of the landscape versus the anomaly that meant something had changed. Genevieve had no history of the wasting sickness the lodge physician diagnosed in the second week. She had no family predisposition. She had presented for a routine check 4 days before the first symptoms appeared, and her blood had been clean, her vitals unremarkable, her body the body of a healthy woman in her mid-50s with decades ahead of her. Isadora watched the progression. She was in the room every day. She noted the rate of decline in her private records, not the official records, her private ones, the ones she kept locked in the cabinet behind the herb wall. The rate was wrong. It was too consistent. Natural illness moves in surges and plateaus. It has bad days and slightly better days in days when the patient almost convinces themselves they are improving. This illness moved like a schedule, like something that had been given a timeline and was keeping to it. She filed it. She labeled the file, "I am probably wrong about this." She kept watching. She kept noting. She sat beside Genevieve in the final days and held her hand and watched the woman she had respected for 20 years leave the world ahead of schedule, and she kept her face exactly as calm as it always was. She was not wrong. 2 weeks after the funeral, she did the full infirmary restock. She always did it herself. She had done it herself for 30 years because she was the one who needed to know exactly what was in every cabinet, every shelf, every labeled vial in the building. She started at 6 in the morning. She worked through the night. At 3 in the morning, she found it. It was in the compound stores, mixed into a base solution that was used in the preparation of 3 different standard medicines, things that would have passed through Genevieve's routine care without a second thought. The compound itself was not something most healers would have recognized. It was old, pre-council era, the kind of knowledge that lived in archive texts that nobody read anymore. Isadora had read them. She had read everything. She stood at her supply cabinet at 3 in the morning with the vial in her hand, and she felt, with a certainty that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with 30 years of pattern recognition, what she was holding, what it meant, what it had done. She set the vial down. She sat in her chair. She did not move for 6 hours. Then she did what she always did. She documented everything. The compound identification, the concentration, the probable administration timeline, the correlation with Genevieve's symptom progression. Every measurement, every date, every observation she had filed under "I am probably wrong about this," and now understood she had been entirely right about. She photographed the tampered label with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. Then she locked it all in the cabinet behind the herb wall, and she went back to work. She did not tell anyone. The audience will want to know why. They deserve an honest answer. She knew whose handwriting was on the tampered label. She had seen that handwriting on council correspondence for 20 years. She knew the individual well enough to understand exactly what would happen if she brought an accusation without evidence that was so airtight it could not be questioned. She had watched what happened to the last person who raised a serious impropriety against someone in that position. A young pack member. Male. Well-liked. He had raised the concern through the proper channels with what he believed was sufficient documentation. Within 3 weeks, he had been reassigned to a remote border post on a rotating schedule that meant he was never in the lodge long enough to build momentum. He was still there. She still sent his annual physical records to the post. She was a healer. She had no rank, no political standing, no allies with enough weight to survive the counterattack that would follow if she moved too soon. In a pack that protected its own, an accusation without irrefutable proof was not justice. It was a target. She would be discredited, her records dismissed, and the person she was accusing would be more protected afterward than they had been before. So she waited. She kept her stores locked. She kept her face exactly as it always was. She kept treating patients and mixing medicines and sitting beside dying elders and delivering babies in winter storms. She kept showing up before dawn and staying after everyone else had gone home, and carrying the knowledge inside her the way you carry something that has no safe place to be put down. She had spent 30 years healing other people's wounds. She had been carrying this one alone. And the particular cruelty of it was that she couldn't tell anyone, not even to put it down for a moment. She just had to keep walking with it. That was 3 years ago. Tonight she was at her window. She did this sometimes. Not obsessively. Methodically. The courtyard below the infirmary was a natural intersection point for the lodge's daily movement, people crossing between the main building and the eastern supply wing, between the guard stations and the residential quarters, between all the places that the lodge's business required people to move between. Isadora had spent 36 years watching the courtyard, and she knew its rhythms the way she knew her patients' vitals. She knew what normal looked like. She watched Goliath Boneclaw cross from the eastern wall toward the main gate at 9:20 in the evening. This was not unusual. He crossed the courtyard regularly. What was unusual was the man he stopped to speak with. She did not recognize the merchant. Middle-aged. Well-dressed in the unremarkable way of someone who has learned that the most useful clothing is the kind that doesn't get remembered. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. She timed it. It appeared casual. Two men briefly acquainted, exchanging pleasantries, separating without ceremony. But Goliath touched his left jacket pocket twice during the exchange. The first time when the merchant arrived. The second time when the merchant left. Both times the gesture was brief and apparently unconscious. The kind of movement a body makes when it wants to confirm that something is still there. She had spent 36 years reading bodies. That touch meant something. She wrote it down. Date. Time. Physical description of the merchant, height, build, clothing, the particular way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right. The pocket touch. The timing. She added it to the file in the locked cabinet behind the herb wall, and she noted that the supply delivery that Callum had mentioned, the medical stores routed to the Eastern Depot rather than the infirmary, had occurred that same morning. She locked the cabinet. She went back to her chair. She picked up her book. The courtyard below was dark and empty now. The lantern by the eastern gate made a small amber circle in the black. She did not sleep. Isadora knew the truth for 3 years and told no one. Some people will say she should have spoken sooner. Others will understand exactly why she didn't. Do you think she was right to wait, or did the waiting make her complicit? This is a genuine question, and I want your honest answer. Tell me below. The second visit was a sprained shoulder. She knew it was a sprained shoulder before he took his coat off. She knew from the way he held the joint slightly forward, the compensating tension in the opposite side of his neck, the barely perceptible adjustment in how he turned when she spoke to him. She had been reading bodies for 36 years. His was not difficult. She wrapped it without comment. He sat on the treatment table and watched her hands work. Not with the distracted patience of someone enduring a necessary process. With attention. The kind of attention a person pays when they are watching something being done well and know enough to recognize it. She did not acknowledge the watching. She finished the wrap, checked the tension, told him to keep the joint elevated for 48 hours and to come back if the swelling worsened. He left without incident. The third visit was a question about a pack member's medication. A routine query about dosage interaction that his own medical staff had already answered correctly the previous day. She knew this because she had spoken with that staff member that morning on an unrelated matter, and the conversation had covered the same ground. She gave Atticus the same answer he had already received. He nodded slowly, as though the answer required consideration it did not require. He stayed 4 minutes longer than the question warranted, standing near the supply cabinet with his arms crossed, not quite finding a reason to leave and not quite manufacturing one. She let him stand there. She went back to her ledger. Eventually he left. The fourth visit was a headache. She looked at him when he said it. A long, level look that contained no judgment and no amusement and communicated with complete clarity that they both understood what was actually happening. He held the look without flinching, which she noted as a point in his favor. She made willow bark tea. She set it in front of him. He picked it up and drank it without breaking eye contact. There was something in that, in the willingness to acknowledge the transparency of the situation without resolving it through speech, that she found unexpectedly restful. He left when the tea was finished. No lingering this time. The headache was cured. The fifth visit, he did not bring an injury or a question. He brought 2 cups of tea. He set one on her table and carried the other to the chair across from her and sat down. He reached across and picked up the book she had left face down on the windowsill and turned it over to read the back cover. Any good? She looked at him over the top of her reading spectacles. I've read it 4 times. Is that a yes or a no? She took her spectacles off. She set them on the ledger. Sit down, she said. It's a yes. He was already sitting. They both knew that. It was not the point. He stayed for 2 hours. They talked about the book. The particular kind of talking that happens when 2 people who read seriously discuss something they have both read, which is less like conversation and more like comparing maps of the same territory. Then about the Eastern boundary history. He knew more than she expected, and she knew more than he expected, and the discovery of that was a small, quiet pleasure for both of them. Then about nothing in particular. The shift between topics and then away from topics entirely, into the comfortable territory of 2 people who have stopped needing the conversation to justify the presence. She could not remember the last time she had sat in a room with another person and not been waiting for them to need something. When he left, he set the book back on the windowsill. Exactly where it had been. Cover down, same page, same angle. She noticed this the way she noticed everything, automatically, precisely, filed without comment. She sat in the silence after he was gone, and she waited for the familiar response. The folding away. The quiet, practiced act of taking whatever had accumulated in the room and putting it somewhere manageable. She had done it reliably for 28 years. It had become a reflex. It did not come. She sat with what he had left behind, and she let it sit there, and she looked at the book on the windowsill, and she did not examine what she was feeling too closely because she already knew that examining it would not change it, and she was too old and too honest to pretend otherwise. She was 59 years old. She had not felt this particular, specific, inconvenient feeling since she was 30 years old. She had forgotten how completely unreasonable it was. The pack noticed before she was ready for the pack to notice. She was never going to be ready for the pack to notice. She understood that a pattern of behavior that was invisible to her was entirely visible to everyone watching from the outside, and she accepted this the way she accepted most inconvenient realities, with composure and without enthusiasm. Callum failed to suppress a smile during a Thursday morning supply check, and she did not call attention to it because calling attention to it would have required acknowledging what the smile was about, and she was not prepared to do that before she had finished her tea. The eyes that followed Atticus when he crossed the courtyard toward the infirmary were a different matter. Those she noticed. She noted the people who watched and the expressions they wore, and she filed them the way she filed everything, under the category of information that might become relevant. Goliath watched from the eastern wall. She noticed this particularly. He watched with the flat, calculating attention of a man running a calculation, not the idle curiosity of someone interested in pack gossip. She wrote it down. She added it to the file behind the herb wall. In the quiet moments after Atticus had gone and before she picked up the next task, she found herself noting the days between visits. Not counting toward anything. Simply noting. The way you note a variable you have not yet decided is significant. She continued working. The routine infirmary supply check in Goliath's personal quarters was something Callum handled every 6 weeks as a standard administrative responsibility. It was not an investigation. It was not surveillance. It was the unremarkable procedural audit of a pack that maintained its medical supply chain through documented verification at every storage point, including those used by senior pack officers. Goliath had never given it a second thought, which was the reason he had not thought to move what was hidden there. The false bottom of the storage chest was well made. Someone had built it with care and skill. Callum found it because he was systematic and because the interior dimensions of the chest did not match its exterior dimensions, and he was the kind of person who noticed that kind of discrepancy and investigated it without drama. He came to the infirmary 40 minutes later. His face was composed with the visible effort of a man who has decided to be calm and is succeeding at approximately 60% capacity. He set the ledger on her table without speaking. She looked at it. She looked at him. She picked it up. She read the first 3 pages standing in the middle of the infirmary floor. Then she carefully closed it. She set it on the table. She looked at Callum with an expression he had never seen on her face in 12 years of knowing her. Not fear. Not surprise. Neither of those things. Something colder and more absolute than either. Confirmation. She sent him out. She sat down. She read the rest of it alone. The compound recipe was on the 4th page. She recognized it immediately, and felt the recognition land in her body, the way physical information lands, as something known before it is processed. The concentration. The base solution. The administration method. Every detail aligned precisely with what she had found in her own tampered supply store 3 years ago and had locked away and documented and carried alone ever since. The timeline was on the 6th page. She matched it against Genevieve's symptom progression from memory because she had reviewed those records so many times that the dates were as familiar as her own age. The alignment was exact. Not approximate. Exact. The Eastern Merchant was on the 8th page. She recognized the physical description. She checked it against the note she had made 3 weeks ago about the man in the courtyard with the slightly elevated left shoulder and the twice-touched pocket. The second target was on the last page. She read the name. She sat with it for a moment. Then she read it again to be certain she had read it correctly the first time. Atticus. There was a timeline for that too. It had already begun. She closed the ledger. She sat at her table. She looked at the wall opposite. She gave herself 30 seconds. The full 30 seconds. She did not cut them short. She sat with the full weight of 3 years of waiting and knowing and carrying it alone, and the particular quality of this moment, the moment when patience becomes something else entirely. And she felt it change in her chest from the dull, persistent heaviness it had been into something sharper and more purposeful. Then she stood. She moved the way she moved when there was a patient in crisis. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Total economy of action. She went to the door and told Callum 4 words. He was already moving before the door closed behind her. She packed the evidence. The original compound vial. The tampered label. Her private records from 3 years of documentation. The ledger. She placed everything in the locked case she kept under the supply cabinet, and she turned the key and she put on her coat. She went to the window. Goliath's quarters lit up across the courtyard. She watched him appear in his doorway, move to the storage room, return with the expression of a man who has just discovered that something is missing and understands immediately what the absence means. She watched him cross the courtyard toward the eastern wall. She watched him find Blackthorn at the entrance to the council corridor. She watched them speak brief, urgent, the body language of 2 men whose plan has just developed a problem they did not anticipate. Then they both turned and looked at her window. She did not step back from the glass. She stood at the window of her infirmary with the locked case of evidence on the table behind her, and she held their gaze across the dark courtyard. Both of them. She looked at them the way she had looked at difficult diagnoses for 36 years, steadily, without flinching, with the complete patience of a woman who already knows what she is looking at and is simply waiting for it to confirm itself. They looked away first. Both of them. She remained at the window. The courtyard lantern made a small amber circle in the dark below. Somewhere across the lodge, Callum was walking quickly. 7 minutes. That was how long she had. She used them to think about nothing except what came next. She was very good at that. She stood at that window and held their gaze until they looked away. No weapon. No title. No rank. Just 30 years of knowing exactly what she knew and being willing to let them see that she knew it. That is a specific kind of courage, and it does not announce itself. Tell me a story about someone you know who has it. Or about a moment when you found it in yourself. I want to hear it. Drop it in the comments. He ran. That is the detail that matters. Not that he came, he was the alpha. He had responsibilities. Responding to a crisis in his own lodge was his function. What matters is that he ran. The most powerful man in the Moonveil pack received 4 words from a woman who had never in all the weeks of their acquaintance asked him for a single thing, and he did not walk briskly across the courtyard. He did not finish what he was doing first. He ran. He arrived at her door breathing harder than he would have liked. He took in the room in the way of a man trained to assess situations, the locked case on the table, the coat already on her shoulders, the particular quality of stillness in her posture that was not calm exactly, but something more concentrated than calm. He took in her face last. He looked at it carefully. He did not ask if she was all right. He could see that she was. What he asked was not tactical. It was not about the case or the coat or the fact that Callum had found him with an expression that communicated urgency without details. What he asked first was personal, in the way that only the most important questions are personal. How long have you known? She held his gaze. 3 years. The silence that followed was the largest silence in the room since Emery died. It was full of things that did not have immediate words, the weight of 3 years of solitary carrying, the shape of what it meant that she had carried it alone, the particular quality of being in the presence of someone who finally understands the full dimension of what you have been living inside. Why didn't you come to me? She had thought about how to answer this question. She had known it would be asked eventually. She had constructed several versions of the answer over 3 years of late nights, and she had discarded all of them because they were each partially true and therefore each partially dishonest, and she was too old and too tired for partial honesty. Because you were grieving, she said. And because I needed proof that couldn't be buried. And because she stopped. She looked at him directly. Because no one has ever believed me quickly enough to matter. The last sentence landed the way true things land when they are said plainly for the first time, without drama, without apology, with the simple weight of a fact that has been true for a very long time. He crossed the room in 4 steps. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the solidity of his presence, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has just understood something about himself that he will not be able to unknow. Something about the gap between the leader he had believed himself to be and the leader he had actually been in the specific moments that required more of him than performance. I'm listening now, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the locked case. She showed him everything. She had done this in her mind many times. The sequence in which the evidence would be presented. The order that would allow each piece to build on the last. She laid it out with the same methodical precision she applied to everything, not performing efficiency, simply being efficient, because efficiency was the most respectful way to handle information this serious. The compound first. The original vial from her supply store. The tampered label. The chemical identification she had documented 3 years ago. She watched his face as he read. He did not speak. Then her private records. 3 years of observation. The correlation between Genevieve's symptom progression and the compound's documented effects. The dates. The decline rate. The analysis she had labeled "I am probably wrong about this," and then never found a single reason to believe. Then the ledger. She opened it to the compound recipe page and set it beside her own documentation and let the alignment speak for itself. She watched his face move through the stages that faces move through when a truth arrives too large and too late simultaneously. Disbelief first, the automatic resistance of a mind that does not want to arrive at this destination. Then recognition, the moment resistance fails because the evidence is too precise and too complete to be argued with. Then something that was not quite grief and not quite rage but contained elements of both, raw and new, the specific pain of a man understanding that everything he had blamed himself for, every way he had failed to see what was happening to the woman he loved. Every moment he had sat helplessly beside her bed and believed he was watching something natural take her, had been manufactured. She had been taken by people he trusted, in his own lodge, under his protection. He sat down. He put both hands flat on the table. He breathed with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man keeping himself functional by sheer discipline. Blackthorn, he said. The name arrived not as a question or a revelation, but as a verdict. A single word that contained the full weight of a decision already made. Goliath first, she said. Blackthorn second. In that order. With witnesses present before either confrontation. The sequence matters. He looked up at her. You have already thought through the sequence. I have had 3 years. Something shifted in his face at that. Not softness. There was no room for softness right now, and they both knew it. Something more like the recognition of a fact that needed to be acknowledged even in the middle of everything else. He had arrived at her door weeks ago with a wound, and she had treated it, and he had come back 4 more times for reasons neither of them had named. And all of it, had been happening while she was carrying this. While she was sitting in the same chair he sat across from her in, drinking tea and discussing books and allowing herself to notice that she counted the days between visits, and simultaneously holding a 3-year-old murder and a locked case of evidence and the full knowledge that the man she was carefully and reluctantly beginning to feel something about was the next intended target. She had not told him. She had protected the evidence first because the evidence was what would save him and sentiment was not. He understood this now. He could see it all at once. Callum appeared at the infirmary door. He had the focused, rapid composure of someone who has been given a clear set of instructions by a trusted authority and is executing them with everything he has. He reported in precise sequence. Goliath was moving toward the eastern gate. A rider was being prepared in the stables, message destination Eastern Territory, the kind of routing that only went one place. The machinery of the conspiracy had registered the missing ledger and was accelerating. The window was narrowing. Isadora updated her timeline in the space of 4 seconds. She gave Callum 3 names, senior pack members with clean records, sufficient standing, and the authority to serve as formal witnesses. She told him which corridors to use and in what order. Then she turned to Atticus and told him precisely which council protocols would freeze Blackthorn's administrative access to the lodge's communication systems before the Eastern Rider reached the gate. He listened. He did not question her sequencing. He stood and he moved and he executed what she had given him with the absolute authority of a man who has just understood that the most strategic mind in the room is not his own and has no problem whatsoever with that reality. The audience sees it in that moment. Not romance. Not hierarchy. Partnership. The real kind. 2 people who are genuinely, measurably better together than apart. Goliath was at the eastern gate when Atticus stepped into his path. He was not alone. Callum flanked 3 feet to the left. 2 senior pack witnesses stood behind, Aldrich, whom Goliath knew and had always believed he could manage, and Elder Voss, whose presence in any formal proceeding made the proceedings irrevocable. The evidence was in Atticus's hands. Goliath was a large man. He had spent his entire career in a position that relied on physical authority and the particular ease of a man who has never been the smallest person in any room. He looked at the assembled group in the torchlight at the eastern gate, and he ran his calculation, and the calculation did not resolve in his favor, and he knew it. He performed innocence anyway. He did it with the desperation of a man who has rehearsed the performance so many times that abandoning it feels more dangerous than continuing it, even when the audience is no longer responding. He appealed to history. He and Atticus had trained together as young wolves. He had served the pack faithfully for 26 years. Whatever this was, whatever someone had told the Alpha, there had been a misunderstanding. He could explain. Atticus listened to all of it. His face showed nothing. The complete, deliberate blankness of a man choosing to give the performance its full run before ending it. Then he opened the ledger to the compound recipe page. He placed it on the ground between them. He stepped back. He waited. Goliath looked at the page. The torchlight was steady. The page was clear. There was nowhere to take the performance from here that the evidence did not immediately close. His shoulders dropped. The drop was total. The whole architecture of the performance, the squared stance, the controlled voice, the managed eye contact came down at once. What was left underneath was not the monster the story might have required. It was something more ordinary and therefore more devastating. A frightened man. A greedy man. A man who had made one catastrophic decision for reasons that had seemed manageable at the time and had been living inside the weight of that decision ever since, and who was now simply exhausted from the carrying. Blackthorn told me she already knew, he said. His voice had lost all its practiced authority. It was very quiet. He said if Genevieve told you, you would tell Atticus, and Atticus would move against the council. He said the pack would fall. He said a lot of things, Isadora said. She had been standing 4 feet behind Atticus. Still. Watchful. The locked case no longer in her hands because its contents were already laid out in sequence on her table in the infirmary behind them. Her voice was completely steady. Write them all down. In Blackthorn's chambers, the Eastern message did not leave the stable. Callum had been standing in the correct position for 40 minutes because Isadora had briefed him on exactly this contingency 4 hours earlier, in the space between closing the ledger and sending him to find Atticus. She had told him what to watch for. She had told him what it would mean. She had told him where to stand. He stood there. The message did not leave. Blackthorn stood at his window. The courtyard below was active with the specific, controlled movement of people executing a plan they had not been part of devising. Pack members he did not own. Witnesses he had not anticipated. The infirmary light across the courtyard burning steadily in the dark. He looked at that window for a long time. He was a man who had spent his entire career managing variables, and he was now looking at the variable he had consistently underestimated, a 59-year-old healer with no rank and no political standing and nothing left to lose, who had spent 3 years building something in the quiet hours when no one was watching. He understood, with the comprehensive clarity that arrives only when it is no longer useful, what he had failed to account for. Inside the infirmary, Isadora stood at her table. The locked case open. Every piece of evidence laid out in the sequence she had designed. Atticus beside her. Not in front. Not behind. The position of a man who has stopped needing to be at the front of things and understands why. You could have run with this, he said. Taken it somewhere safer. Built yourself a position. This is my pack, she said. He turned and looked at her. The particular look of a man who has been searching for something without knowing he was searching and has just found it and is only now processing what the finding means. What do you need? He asked. The same words. Her words. From the first night when he had stood in her doorway with a wound he would not explain, and she had stood and crossed to the cabinet and begun to help him before he had finished deciding to ask. She almost smiled. It was small. It was real. I need you to trust me for about 4 more hours. Done, he said. Without hesitation. Without qualification. Outside, the pack was moving. Blackthorn's administrative access had been frozen under council protocol 7 minutes ago. The Eastern message was burning in the courtyard lantern. Goliath was being escorted to the council holding room with 2 witnesses and a formally opened investigation record. A conspiracy 3 years in the making was coming apart. Not in a dramatic public confrontation. Not in a blaze of righteous confrontation and crowd reaction. Quietly. Methodically. At exactly the seams that Isadora Moonveil had identified and documented and waited patiently in the dark to pull. The way a healer works. Precisely. Without ego. Until the thing is done. He asked her what she needed and she asked for 4 more hours of trust. Not protection. Not rescue. Trust. That is a specific and intimate thing to ask for. Have you ever had that with someone, where trust was the most intimate thing between you? Tag them below. Some people need to be told they have earned it. She spent 36 years being the most useful woman in the pack. She was never once the most celebrated. She was never the most powerful. She was the one who showed up before dawn and stayed after everyone else had gone home, and kept secrets that would have destroyed people who never knew she was protecting them. She carried a murder for 3 years. Alone. Not because she was afraid. Because she was patient. Because she understood that justice without proof is just accusation, and she had too much respect for the truth to rush it. She stopped believing in love at 59. She was wrong about that too. The question now is not whether Blackthorn will answer for what he did. He will. The evidence is irrefutable and the witnesses are in place, and Isadora Moonveil did not spend 3 years building a case to watch it fall apart in the last hour. The question is what happens to a woman who's spent 30 years protecting everyone else when someone finally decides to protect her? What happens when the healer is the one who needs to be held for a moment? What happens when the man she least expected looks at her across a table covered in evidence of everything she survived alone and says, "I'm listening now"? That answer is coming. And it is going to be worth every minute of the wait. If this story found something in you tonight, the recognition of a woman who kept going when no one was watching, who did the work when no one was thanking her, who carried the truth until the truth was ready, then you already know this channel was made for you. Subscribe to Rubiana Alpha Romance Tales. Turn on the bell. Because Isadora's story is not finished. Blackthorn has not faced the pack yet. And there is one conversation between her and Atticus that has not happened yet, the one that has nothing to do with evidence or conspiracy or strategy. The one that is just the two of them. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you there.